Chapter 16. CNN. While I was working freelance in radio in Atlanta in the 80s, I was always looking for other opportunities in the broadcast industry. Somewhere among several calls to the CNN radio network inquiring on employment, the answer was that there might be an opening after the first of the year. One minor issue in that answer was that they didn't actually specify what year. A year or two later, while sitting at the board between traffic reports at Metro Traffic Control, I rolled the dice and called the CNN radio network one more time. A few friends of mine had landed some positions at Turner Broadcasting, so why not give it another shot? Expecting the usual answer of "we don't have anything right now," the department manager surprised me and said he had a position open and for me to come by at first chance. First chance was faster than a speeding bullet out the door and down the road before the phone line disconnected and my days at CNN began. A whole new adventure, with me eventually in shirts with ties and headed to places not even imagined. In October of 1986, I was hired by Turner Broadcasting in Atlanta and began training as a board operator for CNN Radio, the 400-plus radio station news network. CNN Radio Assistant Department Manager Len King was going over my resume while I was waiting. It just so happened that there were 8 current radio station positions listed on it. He walked out into the main newsroom where I was sitting and exclaimed out loud, "I can't believe this guy's resume." The reason was because my career consisted of extensive freelance work on the many radio stations mentioned earlier. It just so happened that a former supervisor of mine at a previous radio station, now soon to be a current co-worker, CNN radio financial reporter and good friend, the late Mike Cavanaugh, was in the room. In a voice reminiscent of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he emphatically confirmed my resume entries. Talk about references available on request. Training for my new position was on Sunday and Monday nights and came quite natural to me since I had already had 13 years of on-air and radio production experience. During the first couple of weeks, I kept my job as traffic reporter at Metro Traffic Control during the day while working Sunday and Monday nights at CNN. For the first couple of weeks, it would be grueling double duty, burning the candle at both ends, working both jobs as traffic reporter while training at Turner Broadcasting. A night or two sleeping in my company car wasn't unusual. It was a relief when the traffic reporting gig finally went away. A few weeks into working part-time at CNN Radio, a phone call came in to me at home, while asleep of course, offering me a full-time position on the radio network. It was a strange feeling since I had worked for myself and freelance for multiple stations for so long. Being quite independent, I had never liked the idea of putting all my eggs in one basket. My reasoning was that if I worked for everybody, I couldn't be fired. That was always my philosophy, and it worked for a long time. I reluctantly, yet excitedly took the job anyway and worked at CNN Radio for 2 years. After 5 months at the original CNN location on William Street in Atlanta, the move was made to the new CNN Center in downtown Atlanta. There would be some great experiences there. At the top of the main life experiences list during that time would be the birth of my second son, Ryan, in August of 1987. He made the wonderful event that much more easy by allowing me to leave my overnight shift at the regular time of 4:30 a.m. in time to be there for his arrival a few hours later. Ryan is a wonderful son and has grown up to be a very fine, compassionate, and easygoing young man. Another actual hands-on memorable radio experience was being right in the middle of covering the 1988 Democratic Convention. Working with folks like Larry King and meeting guests such as former 1972 presidential candidate George McGovern that stopped by for interviews really kept it interesting. Something else great happened when I first came to CNN Radio. My path once again crossed with my old school buddy, Bill Tullis. This was unbelievable. His office just happened to be right upstairs from where I was now working at the CNN Radio Network. We hadn't been in touch in probably 15 years. He was living in Atlanta when I last saw him years before and was doing well then. By just now reuniting with him, it was once again impressive at what all my friends from high school had accomplished. The last thing I remember is that he had been producing music in various recording studios. Then he had landed a position at Ted Turner's Channel 17, later to become Superstation TBS. It was also the precursor to CNN. In 1980, when CNN went on the air, Bill was at the forefront by becoming the chief audio guy overseeing the audio production for all of Ted's ventures. He was producing all the music sounders for Turner Broadcasting as well as traveling around the country producing big-time music in big-time studios with big-time artists. As stated earlier, Bill Tullis was truly off the charts. Bill had been my best friend for many years, but he wasn't really an attractive guy. He was a great guy and very smart, but as mentioned in a previous chapter, he actually had a look resembling what I thought years before but would never say it to his face, of a troll. He was by no means athletic, and unfortunately he had a very sedentary lifestyle. That didn't seem to be the case briefly back in 1967 when he ran up the fire tower in seconds flat, leaving me in the dust, But he was God to the folks in the audio and broadcasting industry. In addition to that, he was also a good sport. I almost bowled over when, and just glancing around his office while we were talking, I noticed that his nameplate in his office actually read Troll. He was listed in the employee directory as Troll. He had Troll written on his parking space. I was doubled over laughing. He was proud of his title. It seemed like I was the only one that knew his real name. If I mentioned the name Bill Tullis to anyone, most people would respond, "Who?" If I said Troll, then they knew exactly who I was talking about. He wasn't Bill Tullis, or Billy, as his mom called him. Of all things, he was Troll. We would be in touch frequently during my entire 10-year period working at CNN. After being at the CNN radio network for about 2 years, I really wanted to get more involved in the overall operation of the network. The company was good about hiring from within, so I would apply for positions that might fit my qualifications. Out of the blue, I received a phone call from Vice President and Senior Executive Producer Bob Fernand's office in late 1988 expressing an interest in my filling a position that I had recently applied for. Since I had applied for so many job listings, I couldn't remember which one I was being considered for. The new job title would be Weekend Production Coordinator, which would entail working as part of a 2-person department referred to as Weekend Production alongside Mary Lally Boysworth. She had already been doing this job on her own for years and was very competent and experienced in technical operations such as master control and the A&B control studios. Training for this job wasn't just a matter of reading and learning some procedures. It was a matter of figuring out where the bodies were buried in order to perform the required duties properly. It was also critical to keep up with the weekend show schedule, with who the producers were, with the ones that were efficient in getting their shows to us on time for air, and to keep an eye on the slackers that we would have to chase down before a deadline. While working at CNN Radio, my schedule had been on the overnight third shift on the third floor, the equivalent of the basement. Any and all of my communication with upper management was by way of paper memos from people upstairs that I would rarely see or interact with. With the new job, it literally took me from the basement to the penthouse overnight, and my attire would instantly go from wearing t-shirts and jeans to dress shirts and ties faster than I could change them. The names on my previous memos were now actual human beings that I was interacting with face to face. The new job was a real roller coaster type of position, depending on what news was breaking at that moment. There were slow news days and there were days when we hustled. But when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991 and making Operation Desert Storm the priority, everything changed faster than you could grab your TV remote. Before that time, security was rather casual in the comings and goings at CNN. All of a sudden there were metal detectors at the entrances. Doors normally left open were now locked. All employees were immediately required to have their ID visible at all times. The days of just waltzing in with just a smile and a wave along with small talk to the security guard were over. This time period was setting the precedent for future live 24-hour news coverage as opposed to just being a 24-hour network running pre-produced news stories with top and bottom of the hour news cut-ins. The world was changing and changing fast. 1994 had the O.J. trial rear its ugly head, the situation that had many of the CNN news anchors on extended coffee breaks during the endless hours of live courtroom drama, only to break in periodically to let viewers know we were still here. The network was also planning for the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, which had been announced in 1991. There was a hell of a lot going on, maybe too much. Working at CNN was my only full-time job ever. It was a great experience. I really cared about my responsibilities, and I did my best to put forth positive and creative energy. It really didn't feel like work at all. Plus, it was the only job I ever had where the phone bill didn't come out of my pocket. Before that, I had been working freelance at 8 radio stations, running my own guitar teaching business, playing regular gigs in my own band, and raising 2 boys. I must say that my boss, CNN Vice President and Executive Producer Bob Fernand, was the best person anyone would ever want to work for. He was very accessible, and he actually cared about the people working for and with him. He truly had my back. The following was another perfect example of when one door closes and another one opens. When Bob Fernand hired me from CNN Radio to the TV side of CNN in 1988, unbeknownst to me, the radio portion of CNN was going to a new automated format. The move was going to relieve a number of people of their positions, including mine. I had unknowingly interviewed for my new position with Fernand just before it was decided that the change at CNN Radio was going to take place. All of a sudden, he knew more than I did by telling me that I would be fine in the new position. He told me that he really wanted me there and to just trust him. I did what I was told since he did actually know much more than I did after all. It was later revealed to me that one of my CNN radio bosses, Len King, also the promo voice of CNN, went to bat for me with Bob just before the bottom fell out on the radio network. Looking back, the situation can be described as standing on the edge of a black hole ready to fall in. In essence, Len King had my back, and in turn, Bob Fernob grabbed me by the seat of my pants and pulled me out just in time before diving into obscurity head first. When I mentioned his act of kindness to him at the CNN Alumni 35th reunion in 2015 in Atlanta, he told me someone had gone out of their way for him in a similar situation early in his career at ABC. By going out of his way to help me, he was paying it forward. I have never forgotten that. As time passed, every now and then the CNN Features Department would allow me to step out to do a story and produce a piece on my own. I really appreciated Southeast Bureau Chief Graylin Young sending me to Nashville to do a piece on a musical event involving the Salvation Army. The one piece I had the most fun writing, producing, and editing for CNN Travel Guide was a story I did on the original Big House, the Macon, Georgia home of the Allman Brothers Band. It was a story I was truly familiar with. CNN Features travel supervisor Sheila Hula totally understood my passion for wanting to produce this project. She really got behind it, making it the lead story on a weekly airing of Travel Guide. As a result of being employed at CNN, there were some other wonderful experiences that I know would have never happened had I not worked there. In 1989, I enrolled in a new college that opened near my home. It was more or less for fun, just taking one course at a time to see if my mind still worked. Then in June of 1993, graduation showed up, letting me get that associate degree I walked away from 20 years earlier. At least now I wouldn't have to walk around leaning to one side while some previous wayward college credits were left fluttering in the breeze. In August of 1993, my summer vacation found me on tour with my band in Washington, D.C. We had some dates booked along the East Coast, along with an annual party that my friend and colleague, the late CNN reporter John Holloman, would host every year. He booked my band to play it this year. Many CNN staffers from the D.C. Bureau were there, as well as a few Atlanta folks. It was definitely a memorable experience and a good time. The party was on Saturday, August 7th, 1993. Also on this trip, I was actually mixing business with pleasure the next day on Sunday by heading into the CNN Washington, D.C. Bureau in order to observe a couple of the Sunday morning news talk shows in progress. It was my regular job to help get these shows on the air back in Atlanta, so my boss in D.C. thought it a good idea to see everything from the other side. It was eye-opening, but a great experience at the same time. That Sunday morning, the guests making the D.C. talk show rounds were then U.S. Speaker of the House Tom Foley, as well as Missouri Congressman Richard Gephardt. I'll have to admit that sitting around drinking coffee with these guys with no cameras rolling was a lot of fun. The band and I then had a couple of days off to hang out in Arlington, Virginia on that Monday and Tuesday before having to head to North Carolina for a gig on Wednesday. My phone rang about 8:30 on Tuesday morning from CNN reporter John Holloman asking me if I'd like to go to the White House. It was going to be a busy news day there, and he thought it would be a great opportunity for me to witness it firsthand. John had already cleared my name with the Secret Service in getting me a credential to be admitted. Within minutes, I was like a man on a mission heading to the nearest Washington, D.C. Metro Rapid Rail station. This was August 10th, 1993, the same day that President Bill Clinton and Vice President Al Gore would sign the budget surplus the U.S. had at the time. While it was just a little over 4 years away from Monica Lewinsky becoming a household name, it was also 10 years to the day that I had picked up my white chip while being welcomed to my first AA meeting. I mentioned earlier at the time I didn't even feel welcome in my own house. Now I'm being welcomed into the White House a decade later. The actual thought was unimaginable in itself. That realization actually stopped me in my tracks as I entered the grounds of the presidential mansion after being cleared by the U.S. Secret Service. There were 3 high-profile ceremonies scheduled that day at the White House. The first was the induction of a new Canadian ambassador held in one of the gardens off to the side of the official residence. Here I was accompanying Holloman as he waited for an opportunity to shout out a hard question to President Bill Clinton regarding the killing of some U.S. soldiers in Somalia. When Bill turned around, he was looking straight at me, thinking I had asked the question. I pointed to Holloman. The next ceremony was the big budget signing event on the south lawn of the White House. Every politician and journalist ever seen or heard of was there. Anybody and everybody from the big D.C. machine was present. By now, I was hanging out with both Wolf Blitzer and John. Between their note-taking and fact-gathering for their stories to be aired later, they would take time to point out different things to me. They would both also go out of their way to introduce me to many folks whose names were also familiar to me. Of course, they had no idea who I was. What was most impressive was that most of these people were hilarious and very genuine off camera. During that high-profile and media-frenzied event, my attention drifted away and focused on a different view. From my position, this time from inside the White House grounds, my perspective enabled me to see directly through the iron fence across to the Washington Monument. It was another unbelievable moment as I pictured myself waking up in my sleeping bag 20 years before on George's lawn. On the edge of a dream, I could actually see my 19-year-old self scared to death and one step away from giving up and going back to Jersey. There I was, peering back through the White House fence from the outside 2 decades before when Richard Nixon lived there. There had been many guitar students, gigs, songs, radio broadcasting jobs, a second chance at life, and 2 wonderful sons from then until now. None of that would have happened had my choice been to let the northbound foot win over the southbound one. How unfortunate it would have been to have not taken that second step. To have spent my life wondering what if would have been nothing short of a tragedy. That moment settled any previous doubts. As the ceremony concluded, Wolf, John, and I made our way back into the White House. Along the way, it was a riot having the late New York Senator Daniel Monahan telling me jokes. Congressman Barney Frank welcoming everyone into the main part of the residence as if he owned the place was priceless. As we were walking to the next ceremony to be held in the East Room of the White House, Holloman pointed me to the Oval Office so I could look in the window. All I could think about was remembering John F. Kennedy saying years earlier that he always liked the job of being president because he could walk to work. The third ceremony of the day was President Clinton's swearing in of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. As everybody packed into the East Room, the faces were all familiar. The Supreme Court Justices, Janet Reno, and Hillary Clinton, to name just a few, were all there. In contrast to a humorous story many years later where Judge Ginsburg admitted to the media that she wasn't 100% sober during President Obama's 2015 State of the Union speech, she definitely was sober as a judge that day. As the doors to the East Room were locked, I couldn't help looking around in awe. This was the room where Abraham Lincoln's funeral was held in 1865, not to mention more history than one could even imagine involving all the presidents that had resided here before. This was a true once-in-a-lifetime experience. After that ceremony, Wolf, John, and I headed back to the White House press room together. Everybody felt really good about the day's events. They were sure that this would certainly go down as a good news day. It was now about 3 p.m., but suddenly the mood was quickly changing. At that moment, the sun was still shining, but it seemed as if a dark figurative cloud was suddenly passing over the area. Some important news was breaking fast, rapidly overshadowing all of the good stuff that would have made for a brighter evening newscast on the networks. As it was, someone at the U.S. Justice Department had just opened the briefcase of Vince Foster, a person connected with the Clinton administration who was recently discovered deceased in his vehicle. There had been scandal brewing over this story for over a week, but now things were heating up. Holloman said he had to leave quickly for the Justice Department to cover this story and asked me if I could find my own way out. I told him I was good and to go on to work. I said my goodbyes and thanked Wolf for a great visit, which he briefly acknowledged. It was obvious that he was already engrossed in front of his computer screen with headphones on writing the next breaking news story. It was definitely time for me to go. I took a leisurely walk out of the White House press room, trying to savor the day's experience, made my way down the long driveway out onto Pennsylvania Avenue, and headed back to the train station. Later that evening, I had a gig with my band at a little blues joint in the D.C. hood called the New Vegas Lounge at the corner of 14th and P Street. It was owned by a nice gentleman and musician referred to as Dr. Blues. During the course of the night, I couldn't help reflecting on the whole day's experience. It was a wonder that I could even remember any of the words to the songs in my set. There were other brushes of greatness back at the Atlanta headquarters now and then. I had gotten to know Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich back in the 80s at events where I would help him get wired up for radio talk shows at other stations, as well as getting him to the set for several political programs during my 10 years at CNN. When he was just a U.S. congressman from Georgia, and I use the term just loosely, he would show up alone on any Saturday morning for a political talk show appearance with a cup of coffee, his tie loosened, and carrying a newspaper. He was very laid back. After all, it was Saturday morning. My job was to meet him at the front security desk to make the journey through the maze of stairs and elevators up to the 7th floor makeup room, then get him to the studio back on the 5th floor in plenty of time for any pre-show briefing and schmoozing. This was his routine for several of his visits, enough for our friendly small talk to be familiar and sincere. Newt would even ask me how my music career was coming along and where I might be performing next. After becoming Speaker of the House, he was once again booked on a Saturday in 1994, with me as his welcoming committee once again. My first CD, Hurricane Blues, had just been released on Atlanta-based Hot Tracks Records. Being quite proud of it, and knowing that Newt would usually inquire on how things were going for me, I decided to bring a copy to give to him, or should I say Mr. Speaker. What I didn't anticipate, and by this time don't you think I should have, was the 10 or so entourage of U.S. Secret Service agents surrounding him. After all, he was now third in line for the U.S. presidency. In this environment, there was no way I could just whip out a CD and hand it to the new Capitol boss without being taken down by the men in black. In telling Newt that I had a copy of my new CD to give to him, he said, "Just hand it to Joe," the Secret Service agent standing next to me. When I did that, Joe said, "Where's mine?" My reply was that had I realized they would all be showing up, I would have brought more. Sometime in 1995, Ted Turner actually said on TV, "I want to be big for a while," as he signed an agreement for CNN to be acquired by Time Warner. Everyone knew that a change was imminent. One Friday afternoon about a year later, June 22nd, 1996 to be exact, I was paged at 4 p.m. to report to another supervisor's office at 5:30 p.m. for a meeting. I wasn't stupid. It was obvious what was going on here. There was an hour and a half to think about what was coming. After 10 years with CNN, I knew I was ready to move on. Hopefully they would not ask me to fix anything, apologize to anybody, or redo anything. My wish at that moment was that they would just let me go peacefully. The meeting was in another supervisor's office. We'll call him Jay. Jay was a guy that had been promoted to a VP position within the last year or two, as I recall. He never did like me, and I didn't like him. To me, he was just a worthless, empty suit. When he told me we were going to part ways, I didn't let on to him that I was happy about it. The truth is that I was cheering inside. When I stood up pretending like I was going to come over the desk at him, he turned white as a sheet. Of course, that wouldn't have been a smart decision since there was a security guard waiting right outside the door. Realizing this scenario had been set up in advance, there was no way I was going to take the bait and risk going to jail, risk an assault charge, or lose my severance pay for this worthless half a hump. Although at the time, it did briefly occur to me that sending him to the hospital might be fun, but it certainly wouldn't have been worth the effort of the serious consequences. Although it would have been like punching a marshmallow, I couldn't risk injuring my hands since I would now need them more than ever to resume making my living as a guitar player. That being said, there was still no way I was going to make his job any easier that day. Jay was only the messenger assigned to do the dirty work. He didn't matter then, and he certainly doesn't matter now. In order to get my severance pay from Turner Broadcasting, I had to sign a waiver saying that I would not come back and sue the company later on. I signed the form, cleaned out my desk, and was then escorted out of the building. The next step was just to get into my SUV with my equipment trailer attached and go to my next gig, which was already booked for later that evening. At this minute, there were many emotions churning at once. Although being somewhat relieved, my life still changed instantly that day in 1996. At the same time, I was pretty well devastated, enraged, and hurt by this termination. How could this happen? I felt I had given CNN and Turner Broadcasting as much of my positive and professional creative energy as I could for 10 years. When calling my wife Jolie, her wonderful response was, "It was the best thing that could have ever happened to you, and you will be fine." Her saying that to me was what led me start the vehicle and head out to the gig as opposed to rolling up in a fetal position and checking out. At 42 years old, all evidence pointed to a gross act of age discrimination as well as a hostile downsizing and cleaning out at CNN. In reality, it wasn't so much about losing my job as it was about being instantly cut off from my many colleagues and friends that I had made over 10 years. I was angry about that more than anything else. They could take this job and shove it, but being shut out instantly from everybody really pissed me off. After all, there was no such thing as social media in those days, nor was there much of an internet as yet. Once that door shut behind me, that was it. It was a disconcerting feeling and wondering what the next step in my life should be after walking out of CNN in 1996. Here I was as his full-time musician again, whether I wanted to be one or not. This wasn't uncharted territory for me since I had already made a living for many years playing gigs and teaching guitar lessons. The corporate world was never for me except for the fact that CNN wasn't your typical hostile corporate environment, at first anyway. It was a rogue organization that ignored all odds of not being successful by proving everybody wrong. Ted Turner was called a maverick, and that he was. This had been a great 10-year run for me. Had I chickened out in 1973 and went back to New Jersey, none of the once-in-a-lifetime experiences I had would have never happened. Now it was time for me to pick up the pieces and reassemble my music career. I was in no mood to try to continue in broadcasting in the typical sense. I didn't have the energy to, nor did I want to try to get another broadcasting job. There would be more opportunities down the line to utilize my experience. Rewarding somewhat, not much financially, but a hell of a lot more fun. The broadcast business, as well as the whole world, was changing quickly as a result of technology. Now was my time to jump back full-time once again into the dysfunctional music business. It too was going through its own massive technology metamorphosis. A year later, Bob Fernand told me that letting me go was one of the hardest things he ever had to do. It was obvious that the orders had come from the top to Bob. I understood that. Many years later, I asked Bob why he couldn't have been the one to actually terminate me since he had hired me in the first place. He explained that there was a corporate chain of command that had to be followed. That was the reason it was handled as it was. Since I had so much respect for Bob and not the worthless suit that did the dirty work, I told him it would have been better for me to have been fired by him. Chain of command or no chain of command, chain of command or no chain of command, I would have been totally fine with it and would have simply said, "Okay, we're cool, thanks for everything," and moved on. Anyone working anywhere could only hope to have a boss as approachable and caring about his people as Bob Fernand was to me. He would kick my ass whenever necessary during the course of the job at hand. That was okay. He still had my back from day one. I usually mention to folks that ask that on that day I left CNN, I just went to my gig and never looked back. At that juncture, I was left to sink or swim with the guitar. It was time to hit the road, which I did. I wrote my own songs, recorded my own CDs, and formed my own record company and music publishing company. Coincidentally, Bill Troll Tullis, the guy that showed me my first radio station back in the 9th grade, had left Turner Broadcasting and was now operating his own professional state-of-the-art recording studio in his home. His whole house was wired for music and audio production. The living room was a separate sound booth in itself. The control room, engineer mixing board, gear, and additional studios were in the basement. It was truly a state-of-the-art and turnkey operation. I recorded some songs there, as well as having mixed and mastered several projects in Bill's facility. He and I had come full circle in the course of 40-plus years. When I think about the turns my meager career has taken over the years, I can only look back on how I got here, wherever that is. While traveling from time to time on I-75 heading to and from Florida, I still always steal a glance off the Valdosta, Georgia exit in fond reflection to see what is left of the Azalea City Motel. That was the motel his folks owned, where they let Billy and I stay on that Saturday night back in 1967. Seems like every time I pass by it now, there's always a different motel chain sign in front of it. No telling how many buyouts from who knows how many motel corporations have staked their claim on that property over the years. Billy didn't just show me my first radio station. He also showed me my first motel room. 2 places I would spend a lot of time in throughout my life. The impact of this wasn't quite fully realized until I wrote it down in this chapter. Bill Troll Tullis unknowingly programmed my whole life and set my whole destiny in motion. Over the years, I had apparently told this story enough times that when my phone rang a few years ago while on the road in the Midwest, it was a former CNN colleague calling me to tell me that Troll had passed away at age 58. This news really saddened me and threw me for a loop, but it really didn't surprise me. I knew Bill had some health problems due to having lived an inactive lifestyle as far back as I could remember. Even back in high school, he would complain of ailments requiring frequent medical appointments. He would laugh when I would half-kiddingly challenge him to come outside and throw a football around. He wanted no part of it. When I would go to recording sessions in his studio, it was obvious that things hadn't really changed much after 40 years. His sedentary lifestyle had really caught up with him on an adult level. It is sad to say the complications from that are what took him out. I was proud to have known Bill Tullis and to have called him my best friend. He and I had truly come full circle. Most everyone will remember him as Troll, but I will always remember him as Billy. To this day, whenever I see those lonely red lights blinking on top of towering radio transmitters, I feel like Billy is watching.